And at this point, next up, it's my pleasure to introduce the technical director of Mimecast. Please give a warm AUSCERT welcome to Alison O'Hare. Hey, you made me a believer, believer. Hey, you made me a believer, believer. Hey, let the bullets fly, let them rain. My life, my love, my time, it came from.
Well, thanks everyone for being present at this presentation. What I'm going to be talking today about is cyber resilience for email, and it seems like a really fitting topic based on what this event is all about, and also if you think about what AUSCERT stands for in terms of cyber security. This is just taking that notion a step further, so thinking about not just protection and detection, but also thinking what happens before and during after an event. You can't protect yourselves from every type of event, especially in an email world. So how are you preparing for the worst and making sure that you can recover? So my name is Alison O'Hare. I'm the technical director for Mimecast. And what I want to do is go through some of the aspects of cyber resilience. So a bit of a quirky photo here, but the gentleman that's highlighted at the right there is a guy by the name of Nathaniel Bernstein. He's the technical scientist at Mimecast, and really what is important about him? He was one of the guys who developed or invented MIME for email, which is obviously the ability to send attachments, and he actually sent the first attachment in 1992. So if you think about email, it's been around for a really long time, but it's also come a very long way if you think about how important email is to our organizations nowadays. So there are lots of definitions around cyber resilience. I really like this one because I think it kind of encompasses a lot of key pointers or key facts. The first thing is the ability to adapt. So as I said, it's not about necessarily being able to prevent everything, but do you have the processes in place that you can adapt to your scenario or the situation? It also talks about cyber events. So for a lot of us, we think about malicious attacks, but the reality is that there's also technical failure and human error which cause these events as well. External or internal, I think most of us think that a cyber attack, for example, is going to come from the outside world into your organization. But you also have to think about internal threats as well, with compromised users or malicious internal users. And then whether it's intentional or unintentional, and then focusing on confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So that's your CIA triad, which is still the cornerstone of cyber security. So emails really come to a convergence of risk. And I think a lot of this is around is migration to the cloud. So all organizations here, I'm sure, are moving at least some services or data into the cloud. And that's a reality. There are lots of benefits by moving to the cloud, but you do create a monoculture environment or centralization. They say that about 50,000 organizations are moving to Office 365 every month, and that there are currently 100 million users consuming the product. Now, like I said, there are lots of benefits, but what you lose is the ability to benchmark or test the environment. And for some, they say, not only are you putting your eggs in the same basket by moving, say, OneDrive, Office 365, email, Skype for Business, but also you're putting your eggs in the same basket as everyone else. So it really creates that single lock to pick. So what happened if something did go wrong? It would be a real seismic event because so many people consume the product. Other aspects of email in terms of the convergence of risk is going to be threats. In the good old days, we were only concerned about spam and virus, right? But there's obviously been a whole lot of evolution in terms of sophistication and how deep they penetrate into our organization. So if you think about things like there was phishing, then there was spear phishing, then there was weaponized type attachments, and now it's really moved to a world of social engineering. So understanding the hierarchy within your business, but also the communication paths and planning that perfect malware-less attack. You also got to think about data. It's interesting for us as an organization because whereas last year we talked a lot about security, now with some of the regulations like GDPR and NDB, we're talking a lot about data. People want to make sure that they have that secondary copy, but also they have control over that data. And then users. Users are always going to be your weakest link. No matter how much protection, prevention, detection you put in place, you have to make sure that the users are aware of the risk because technology can only do so much. What I'm going to talk through is really the 4 pillars that we feel makes up cyber resilience. And with all this convergence of risk, you have to take an holistic approach or resilience approach. You can't treat all of these issues in isolation. There are four main aspects to this. So you've got your defense arms race, which is constantly trying to adapt to the threats that are out there. You've got your skills requirements, so making sure not only can you deal with the technology, but also how do you look at it analytically? How do you make sure that you can make sense of all of that information? You've got your business disruption. I think this is key. I think a lot of people, when they move to the cloud-based service, you lose a lot of your control, or you introduce risk that you would have had control over. So things like a DR site or having the ability to have a backup and restore functionality, you could lose. So you have to think about how do you continue to provide email to your users and other services as well, but also do you have a compliant copy of that data that's totally separate to the rest of the application? So why do we talk about a defense arms race? And it really focuses on why email is so important. And I think everyone here will acknowledge it's their key business application, right? You keep your clients happy, you're speaking to your customers, you're sending contracts, you're sending orders through, you have meeting invites. It all focuses around email. So you need to make sure that that's available. But as well, if you think about the world of cybercrime, they love email because it's such a key application. So about 225 billion emails are sent every day, and obviously that number is growing. If you also look at the key entry point for any threats in your organization, it's going to be email. And 91% of threats come through the organization start with a spear phishing attack. And then in terms of the volume of mailboxes, you can see that's rapidly increasing from 6.3 billion mailboxes today to they predict to be about 7.7 billion in 2021. So I want to visually represent this, really looking at these four key pillars and how to think about your cyber resilience strategy. The first, as I mentioned, is that defense arms race. So I've been at Mimecast for over 10 years now, and really what I've seen is that shift in terms of the trend from the gateway, where you had that email had some sort of viral payload, or there was some spam associated with the email, where we now move into a world of email-borne threats that really take that user's second stage interaction to kick off that next threat. So over time, we've all adapted to these types of threats by adding multi-layers of technology. And that is pretty good, right? But you're never going to have a totally bulletproof result. So first was anti-spam, then it was antivirus, then you're looking at things like phishing. That progressed to be more targeted in terms of spear phishing. Then you had your weaponized type attachments, which required things like sandboxing. Now you've got your social engineering, which is a lot more difficult to catch because there's nothing necessarily specifically wrong with that email. You also have to think about endpoint security, your web security, your web proxying. And then what about your insiders? How are you going to control the threat that could be disseminated internally? If we look at the trends over time in terms of email and start to the 1980s, they actually say the first virus was a creeper virus in 1971. It wasn't associated necessarily with email, it was about mainframes, and it wasn't malicious, but it had the ability to execute something. This obviously changed over time, and they say that the first recorded ransomware was in 1989, and this was delivered to UK magazine subscribers and requested payment to a PO box in Panama. But as more people consumed the internet and started using email, so the threats evolved as well. You had your first polymorphic virus in the 1990s, and in the 2000s, we really saw an increase in spam. Now, spam in those days was an irritation, right? A nuisance. It wasn't necessarily a threat as such. It didn't do anything malicious to the environment. And the spammer got paid on the number of clicks on a URL, but the URL didn't lead you to a credential harvesting website, for example, which we see now. But as people got more into the world of email, they then decided they needed to use a gateway. And a lot of companies started having some kind of multi-layered technology in the 2000s. We also saw viruses like the I Love You virus and the Anna Kournikova virus. I remember working for an organization in the UK when the I Love You virus came out, and it totally brought the organization to a standstill. Things have progressed. Now what we see, as I've talked about earlier, is your advanced threats. So 2013 was CryptoLocker, 2016 was Locky, 2018 was Base Striker. These are going to continue to evolve. And what's next? We look at homoglyphs and homographs with a combination of ASCII and Unicode text. And what else in terms of social engineering? Because that's where I think a lot of risks are going to be coming from as well. So one of the things that we're starting to look at is supply chain fraud, where the folk that you're dealing with in terms of consultants, people understand that relationship and their profile, and they're going to try and request information or money, pretending to be from one of those suppliers. So the next aspect in terms of visually representing cyber resilience is a skills requirement. So as you layer this technology, not only do you have to look after the technology and make sure that you can manage and monitor it, but what about the analytical side? So with all these layers in terms of technology, you're going to be producing a lot of logs. You may have a SIEM environment where you want to feed the API into, but you also need to understand what you're looking at because you want to have an holistic approach, not just around your email security, but about all your security applications. Then you need to get your board executives, your C-level execs on board in terms of understanding cyber security and cyber resilience. So how do you make sure that they understand how important it is and the risks associated with it? And how do you make sure that you're constantly updating your users about these threats? So this basically goes around a cycle. You've got to deliver the technology, you've got to make sure you've got people to manage it, you've got to make sure that your users understand it, but then you also have to make sure that operationally you can handle the logs and the results of what this is producing. So where are the deficiencies? If you're going to seek and look for IT roles that are currently available, in terms of IT security, there are a lot of roles, and a lot of them have been open for more than a month. AUSCERT had a report where they said that in the next decade there's going to be 11,000 roles available for cybersecurity because it is an evolving world and there's so much skill set required for this. If you looked at a Ponemon industry report, they said that 69% of those surveyed said that the reason for the lack of responsiveness was based on a lack of expertise within their IT team. And I looked at a report in terms of a simulated event where you obviously send out your users what would be a kind of spear phishing attack, and they said that they had a 9% success rate in terms of clicks, which is alarmingly high if you think of how much error that would introduce into your environment. So in terms of user behavior, you really have to think of it in two ways. Firstly, you want to do your simulated attacks. I think that's a great idea. Obviously, you're giving your user that testing point. But you also need to develop your teaching moments. So making sure that you're constantly reminding them lots of awareness, whether it's posters, whether it's think before you click campaigns, but making sure that they acknowledge that there is a risk out there. So the next aspect to cyber resilience is going to be business disruption. So when you were on-premise, you would have had a DR environment, you would have had some kind of high availability, you would have had backup and restore. When you move to the cloud, you often lose this. So how do you make sure that in the event that something goes wrong, if we acknowledge the fact that it will and it can, that you can continue to be productive, that you can make sure from a reputation standpoint, you can make sure from a financial standpoint, not just email, but other services are available. You need to make sure that you have a user base that can continue to work through user applications or mobile apps, for example. You have to make sure that you're also applying the policies and the controls that you would have applied if those services were up. If you look at when Petya or non-Petya came out, there are organizations, and I'm thinking of a particularly large law firm, that were brought down for 5 days. They ended up using personal email accounts, which from a reputation standpoint is obviously not great. But also when you're back up and running, you're losing a lot of data that would have been sent from those personal accounts. What does business disruption mean to your business, and how do you measure it? Ponemon Industry also did the cost of a cyber attack in 2017, and they said that 6.88 million Australian dollars is what the average cost of a cyber attack is. Now this is pretty high, and if you think about a smaller business, that could absolutely kill them and put them out of business. And it takes on average 23 days to recover from a ransomware attack. And if you think about the disruption, if you think about the lack of productivity, that could be quite startling. Lastly, in terms of cyber resilience is data. Data hostage, data compliance, data availability. You have to make sure that you have a secondary copy. If you think about things like CryptoLocker, if you think about ransomware, how do you make sure if something happened to that data that you can get a totally separate copy? The problem is if you pay a lot of these guys, they don't necessarily give you your data back, or they give it back for a period of time, and then once again they'll encrypt it. So do you have a backup solution? Have you tested that backup solution to restore? If you're in the cloud, do you have the ability to have that? And how do you make sure, from a regulation point of view, that you not only have a separate copy of data, but that it's secure and you have control over it? In terms of regulations, they say that it's acceptable to have a 4-hour RPO and RTO. But if you think about moving to the cloud, you don't have control. If they have an outage, you're at their mercy to resolve that outage. And it's not necessarily a full outage. It could be authentication that goes down, as we saw quite recently with Office 365. So how do you make sure that you can continue to work and provide that service to the business? Now, once again, going back visually, a lot of companies, a lot of organizations think of a defense-only strategy. So what they want to make sure is that they have good protection, detection, prevention. So, and you can get great technology out there, you can make sure that you're blocking as much as can be possible, but we all know with zero-day attacks that you can never keep up with it. There's so many communities out there, there's so many people who've got a lot of time in their hands, and ransomware as a service is a very real thing, right? You don't need a lot of skill, you don't need any money to be able to use ransomware as a service. You get a free help desk potentially, you get a shopping cart, you get videos on how to adapt to the technology and use it. If you look at things like Kali Linux, which is for penetration testing, or Metasploit, they actually have a database of exploits that you can use. If you go with a single cloud posture, you also need to think through this quite carefully. Of course, if you go with something like G Suite or Office 365, they're phenomenal platforms. But you also have to think about that broader holistic approach. So we've got a multidimensional problem here. How do you make sure that you've got the best of breed in terms of security? How do you make sure that you've got the necessary logs and information and control? They also have a great SLA in terms of uptime, but the reality is that we know that there are incidences when they've gone down, and that's when you lack control. There's nothing you can do but wait until they come back up. And how do you make sure that you have that copy of data? So we really think about this as being a multidimensional problem, as I mentioned, but it really requires a multidimensional approach. So making sure that you've got the best of breed in terms of security, and you're doing as much as you can, obviously, in terms of protection and prevention. But that also, that you're using the analysis, the APIs, the analytical stuff to analyze your environment, but also leaning on a messaging SOC, so you can understand the threats that are shared globally, and we have a really good understanding of what's going on out there. You also want that platform, so in the event that something goes wrong with your email environment, you have the ability to continue to work. So you have a continuity platform where you can automatically fail over, where your users can remain productive. And then finally, you want that second copy of data. So making sure it's fully compliant, making sure that you have control over it in terms of retention. And if you think about things like GDPR, the right to be forgotten, I think is pretty scary for a lot of people. If you got a request to remove all data about a specific individual, do you have the ability to do that? Do you have the process? Do you have the ability to prove that as well? So going back to the whole notion of cyber resilience and that definition, once again, it's about planning before, what happens during, and how do you recover after. And just to highlight, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the types of events, it's going to be your malicious attack, which we all know about and have spoken about. You get your human error. One example is an AWS engineer who was following a playbook to do an update, and it was just a simple typo, but it had a dramatic effect on a lot of that technology. If you also look at Telstra, they have outages. One of those was caused by an engineer rebooting a node. And then in terms of tech failure, you hear about Office 365, they have a 9-hour outage due to an EOP infrastructure update. So the reality is you have to be prepared for all of these events. One of the things that Mimecast ran at the RSA conference last year was a cyber resilience think tank. And they produced a report which I thought was really interesting. They took C-level execs, risk strategy folk, and they got them into a room and talked about what cyber resilience means to them. And some of the key takeaways were things like psychology change, understanding the fact that you have to be prepared for it, that it's going to happen, but you have to acknowledge the fact that, you can't protect yourself against everything. Looking at event types, which we've spoken about, your CIA triads, always focusing on confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Being prepared, so having an incident response plan in place, making sure that you practice it. Do you know what would happen in the event that there was a malicious attack or there was an outage of some sort? And then humans. How do you address the issue of humans? Making sure that your users are constantly aware of the threats and what they can do. So just to kind of sum up, in terms of the key resilience outcomes for cyber resilience, really the key takeaway for me is making sure that you understand how you would continue to work in the event of something going wrong. Because if your systems were down, not just from an email point of view, but if your systems were down, if there was a malicious attack, if your data was corrupted or encrypted, how do you make sure that your users can work? Because the key thing is if users are working, they're remaining productive, the business continues. You want to make sure it's seamless, you want to make sure that you've got end user tools, you want to make sure that you've got that control. And that basically means that you can survive through the event and then obviously adapt to that process and then continue. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison.